I used to love my job. I was a guard on a wind farm. All I had to do was make the rounds a few times a night to make sure nobody was tampering with the wind turbines. I read a lot of books, and when I got bored, I'd take my portable DVD player and watch films all night. The only thing that broke up the time were the patrols. I'd arrive every night around 9 p.m. and be relieved by the day shift at 9 a.m. There wasn't much to it. I'd pull up next to the guard I was relieving. We'd exchange pleasantries. He'd tell me if anything had happened during the day, and then he'd be on his way. I don't remember him ever telling me anything more than that he'd seen a deer, or maybe a bear. There were a dozen windmills spread out over 5 miles, each connected by a dirt road. When I first started working for the company, I would get out and check the locks on the access door to each windmill. After 5 years, I'd drive by and barely look at the things. Most of the time, I'd still be watching my film or TV show as I drove. There was not much traffic on the dirt road. I only drove into a ditch once, but I got the car out with minimal difficulty. The worst part was the embarrassment. One evening, I was in a hurry and running late. I jumped in the car and drove to work with something nagging at the back of my mind. I made it in time, got my report, and settled into my routine. I made my first lap without a problem. Dusk had just fallen and the world was plunging into the darkness of night. Clouds had been forming all evening and I saw a flock of turkeys crossing my path near one of the fields. That meant there was going to be a storm. My first pass was a breeze. Nothing happened. I didn't even see any of the animals I usually see, apart from the turkeys. Maybe because it was going to storm, the other animals were battening down the hatches and hunkering down wherever they were. The drive around the 5-mile dirt circle took about 30 minutes. They don't like us going very fast, and technically we're supposed to check the door on every wind turbine. Myself and the other drivers timed it so it looked like we were checking. I got back to the main building just after 9:30 a.m. I took out my portable DVD player and started watching Die Hard. Of course I fell asleep. I woke up as the credits rolled. Remembering my missed round, I threw the car into gear and drove off towards the wind turbines. It was then that I remembered what I had forgotten. A flashing light signaled low fuel. I cursed myself for forgetting to fill up on the way home yesterday. This is my second lap, I thought. I should have enough to make it through the rest of the night and get to a petrol station. I clung to this thought for the rest of the night. My second lap was uneventful. My eyes were constantly drawn to the fuel gauge, but there was nothing I could do about it. Once you were in for the night, you had to stay. If you were caught driving away, you'd be fired. I didn't want to lose such a good job, so I stayed put, although there were a couple of times I considered a quick 2-mile trip to the petrol station. The problem was my boss. He was a bit of a prick and liked to do surprise inspections at all hours of the night. He liked to pretend he was a nice guy and show up to see if I needed anything. But I knew why he was really there. If he turned up tonight, I would ask for a few gallons of petrol. Maybe that would solve my problem and keep him from checking in so often. Halfway through my second film, Die Hard 2, I naturally went for my next lap. It had just started to rain, so my windows were misting up and my defroster wasn't working too well. By the time I got to my fourth lap, the weather had decided to go from mildly annoying rain to grab the animals and head for the Ark. It was raining so hard I could barely see ahead. I drove at a crawl. The rain had made ruts in the road. In some of the lower depressions, there were puddles all over the road. I was glad I was driving a Jeep. I was in the middle of one of these huge puddles when my engine gave out. I cranked and cranked, but it was no use. I was out of petrol. I would never live that down. I could hear it now. 5 years from now, the other guy would be telling the story of the guy who ran out of petrol in the middle of a rainstorm. So now I had a decision to make. Do I stay in the car and ride out the storm, or do I walk back to the main building and wait for the day shift to arrive? I checked my watch. Almost 8 hours until my relief arrived. The way it was raining, there was no way I was going to walk back. If there'd been an emergency can of petrol, I might have considered it, but there hadn't been any for a long time. Another wonderful gift from my idiot boss. He said it was a waste of gas to let it sit around and get old. I guess the word emergency never crossed his mind. I didn't want to drain my battery, so I stopped watching films. I sat and listened to the rain pounding on the roof of my car as if someone was dropping marbles from the sky. That's when my mind started to play tricks on me. I guess it was as bored as I was and decided to have some fun. I was whistling a little tune in my own off-key way that makes people put cotton in their ears, when I happened to look in the rearview mirror, and the mirror looked back. I swore I saw a pair of eyes looking into the rear window. I whipped around so fast I broke my neck, but there was nothing there. Just to be sure, I pressed the door lock button, as if that would help in the middle of nowhere in a downpour. My whistling got louder and louder as I did everything I could to avoid looking in the mirror. Finally, it was too much. My eyes were drawn to the mirror like a magnet. I looked. There was nothing there. I laughed nervously at myself for being so stupid and leaned my head back against the headrest. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up to nothing. No sound of rain, no sound of animals, not even crickets. It was unnerving. I lowered the window a few inches and listened. There was still no sound, not even the whirring of the wind turbine blades as they turned. I looked at the nearest one, and the blades were still. It was unusual for the wind to be so calm that it couldn't muster enough energy to turn the blades. I checked my watch and found that I had been asleep for 4 hours. The storm clouds had lifted, and the moon had appeared. It wasn't quite full, but it was bright enough to illuminate the ground and cast hundreds of shadows on the trees that surrounded me. It was a beautiful night, the kind of night that made me glad I lived in rural Pennsylvania. It made me seriously reconsider waiting in the Jeep until morning. There was a tug of war in my mind as I hummed. Should I stay or should I go? I looked at my watch again. In just under 4 hours, my relief would be driving through the gate. What would he do if I wasn't there? It would be a lot easier to explain and get him to get me some petrol than to wait for him to make his first lap and find me sitting in the middle of the road. My mind was made up. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove box and stared for a long moment at the handgun sitting next to it. I thought about it, but decided to leave it behind. Most of the animals in these woods want nothing to do with humans, and the others can be easily scared away with a little yelling. I locked the door as I stepped out and my foot landed in a deep puddle. I sighed as the water trickled past my ankle and filled my trainers. The puddle surrounded the entire car. It was easily 12 feet across. I knew hopping on one foot wouldn't do anything but get my clothes wet, so I put my second foot down and closed the door. I started to wade across the puddle to the other side until I found dry land. I shone my light on the nearest wind turbine. It was number 5. I knew it was the furthest one from the gate because it was halfway. It didn't matter if I went forward or back. I decided to go forward and I started walking for the first part of my journey. The only sound I heard was the crunch of my shoes. It was unnerving, your only companions being total silence and hundreds of shadows cast by the trees. I shone the torch into the trees and saw many eyes looking back at me, but they were silent. It was as if they were sitting in the pews of a church, and I was walking up the aisle looking for my place. The eyes ranged in size from small to quite large, and yet not one of them made a sound. Were they really afraid of me? I paused to take a break, and that's when I heard it. A footstep behind me. It wasn't a heavy thud, but the soft crunch of grass under a large foot. I whirled around and shone my light where I thought the sound was coming from, but there was nothing. I swung the light around, but all I saw was a gravel road and endless trees. Seeing nothing was perhaps worse than seeing something. A deer, a bear, even a coyote would have been something I could have dealt with, chased away, fought off. But nothing created this void that my mind filled with all kinds of horrible creatures. The unnerving silence continued as I began to walk faster without thinking. Even the crunch of my shoes seemed louder in the absence of forest sounds. I began to think about my destination. It was tempting to cut through the forest and save a lot of time, as I was still on a long loop of road. Had it been daylight, I might have considered it. In the middle of the night, with an almost full moon over my shoulder and dawn hours away, I didn't give it a second thought. I thought maybe whistling would calm my frazzled nerves. I tried whistling the happiest tune I could think of, but the echo came back to me bent and twisted, like the children's song in a horror film. I stopped whistling soon after it began. I was halfway through a stanza when the melody died on my lips. The sudden, unexpected silence brought me the terrible gift of another footstep behind me. I whirled around as fast as I could, shining my torch around. This time, my mind didn't have the luxury of scaring me with nothing. This time, I saw a pair of eyes. They were large and red, but the most unsettling thing about them was their distance from the ground. Whatever it was, its eyes were a good 8 feet off the ground. It was 40 or 50 meters away, hiding behind a tree, but those eyes will haunt me for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, I didn't know how long that would be, especially with such a monstrously large creature obviously stalking me. I'd like to say that I carefully weighed my options and came up with a reasonable solution to what this creature was and how to deal with it. But I didn't. I ran like the devil himself was after me. It surprised me that I still had my torch. I found a speed I never knew I had. Desperation will do that. My mind was racing faster than my feet, but there was no solution it could come up with. I could hear the footsteps coming closer behind me. It was going to catch me. It was only a question of when. While my mind was grasping at straws, my salvation was rising before me like a lighthouse for a lost fisherman. One of the wind turbines loomed before me. I knew the code to get inside in case I ever had to shut one down in an emergency. I didn't think I could run any faster, but when I heard the footsteps behind me and saw my salvation in front of me, I felt like Roadrunner as he sped up and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. It was all in my head, of course. Reality shattered my illusion as the sounds of massive feet came closer. It no longer cared about stealth. I could hear it on the dirt road now. My curiosity wanted to turn around and at least identify my pursuer, but I forced myself to concentrate on what was in front of me. To stumble because I wasn't concentrating, or because I saw the creature that would be my undoing, would be disastrous. The 400-foot monolith loomed before me. I imagined where the keypad was, knowing I had one chance to enter the code before my untimely death. As rescue approached, panic set in. I became obsessed with the idea that I would be captured at any moment. I have no idea what made me do it, other than sheer terror and desperation. I took the only thing I had at my disposal, my torch, and threw it backwards. By some miracle, I heard a muffled thud and a slight moan. The sounds came from much closer than I would have liked, but I still refused to look back. I reached the door to the turbine, punched in the code, and yanked the door open, my arms straining under the weight. As soon as I was inside, I pulled the door shut. Just before it latched, a set of massive fingers appeared in the doorway. I pulled with everything I had, feeling my muscles strain to the point of breaking. The door somehow continued to close. The giant fingers were slammed between the door and the frame. They disappeared, and I heard an inhuman howl from the other side. As I closed and locked the door, I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as my mind replayed the image of the fingers appearing in the doorway. Like a frozen replay, I saw with startling clarity. The fingers were the size of bratwursts, covered in brown hair, with claws protruding from them. I lay on the floor, panting, searching for some way out, but finding none. I felt safe for the moment, but how long would that last? How would anyone find me here? Would they even look, or would they think I was lost in the woods? And the biggest question of all, what the hell was that thing? I didn't want to speculate because the possible answers were too horrible to comprehend, especially with whatever it was still out there somewhere nearby. Just as I felt my adrenaline start to wear off, there was a knock at the door. It echoed through the huge hollow tube that was now my salvation and my prison. I jumped up, not knowing what to do. My only way out was into the claws of a monster. I looked around for help, but found none. I resigned myself to waiting for my inevitable demise. I could see the door vibrating with each impact. I knew it was made of strong metal, but even metal has its breaking point. As I scanned the small room, barely 10 feet across, my eyes were drawn upwards. There, attached to the side, was a ladder. It went up into infinity. There seemed to be no end. Thankfully, there were lights along the side every few meters, but that was of little comfort. I considered my options. Wait here for the door to collapse, or make an impossible climb straight up with no rest stops, no timeouts, no do-overs. If I climbed, it would be all or nothing. If I fell halfway up, I would have to climb all the way back down to my current hopeless position. I had no idea if I had the strength or stamina for such a climb. But another round of banging on the door made me decide. I stepped tentatively up the ladder as if waiting for the rung to give way under my foot. After a moment, I stepped onto the second, then the third. The fourth rung brought near disaster. I slipped and fell back to the ground, landing in a puddle. This was a painful reminder that my shoes were soaking wet. Even though there were grips on the rungs, I had to be extra careful and step on the arch of my foot, not the ball. I stood up and checked for injuries. I was sure there would be a bruise or two if I survived. But other than that, the only thing hurt was my pride. The banging on the door refocused my priorities. I stood and started up the ladder, this time using the arch of my foot. I started slowly, making sure each foothold was secure, before moving on to the next rung. Soon I was gaining confidence and moving a little faster. My breathing became ragged as the effort sapped my energy. I regretted skipping dinner and hadn't eaten any of my snacks that evening. I stopped climbing and hooked my arm into the ladder to keep me from falling while I caught my breath. Then I made two mistakes. One was looking up, the other was looking down. When I looked up, it seemed I was no closer to the top than when I started. When I looked down, I saw that I had made enough progress to kill myself if I stumbled. There was something else I saw when I looked down that made me want to cry. There were several safety harnesses hanging on the wall. There was a metal cable running next to the ladder. For a brief moment, I considered climbing back down to get a harness, but I realized that I might not have the strength to climb back up. The rest of the climb seemed to take forever. My breaks became more frequent and longer each time. My feet were screaming at me to rest. I was almost exhausted when I looked up and saw the top of the ladder. The excitement carried me the rest of the way up. I climbed down from the top of the ladder and collapsed onto the metal landing. I lay there for what seemed an eternity until my strength returned. I stepped through the door that led to the generator room. It was cramped as the machinery took up most of the room. There was a small walkway next to the generator and a hatch that opened to get outside. I looked around and found a safety harness. I put it on and secured the line to a hook. As I opened the hatch to the outside, dawn had broken and the world was lit in the brilliant orange of early morning. The beauty was so overwhelming that I didn't notice the wind, which had been calm after the storm, now whipping at me, threatening to knock me off my feet. I stumbled, grateful for the safety line. I watched as one of the massive blades passed a few meters away. My only reason for taking the risk was to look down and see if my pursuer had given up and left. I slowly peered over the side, fighting the nauseating dizziness from the sheer height. I looked around at the tiny trees below and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I was about to go back inside when I saw movement. It was the creature. It had come around the other side of the base of the turbine. I marveled at how tiny it looked from up here, yet it still presented me with the riddle of how to escape. I went back inside and looked around for the answer. After a short search, I found a radio among the controls on the wall. I pressed a button and an alarm went off. I pressed it again to silence it. I tried another button and was rewarded with static. "Hello, hello, can anyone hear me?" I said into the microphone. I repeated it again and still got static. On the third try, my boss answered. "What the hell are you doing in one of the units?" he said. It was an emergency and this was the only way I could contact someone." He harped on the other end. "What was the emergency?" "I'd rather not say on the radio," I said. "Can you come and get me?" He sighed. "What unit are you in?" "Number 6. It'll take a while." "How long?" "As long as I get there," he grumbled. The line went static again. I felt some relief that at least someone knew where I was and was coming to get me, eventually. Out of curiosity, I climbed back outside and leaned over to look at the creature. My blood turned to ice at what I saw. The creature looked up at me. It must have heard the alarm. Then it did what would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It started to climb up the outside of the wind turbine. My eyes were drawn to the terrible sight and could not look away. I kept hoping it would lose its grip and fall, but it didn't. It came closer and closer. When it was about halfway up, my mind awoke to the danger and sent my body into action. I dove back in and closed the hatch. I unfastened the safety line and made my way back to the main ladder. Going down the ladder took much less time than going up. Several times in my haste, I slipped and almost took the fast track down, which ended in death. Finally, I made it. As I took a moment to catch my breath, I heard the top of the turbine being attacked. The bangs reverberated down the tube, making it sound even louder. I opened the door as quietly as I could, hoping that the noise the creature was making above would cover my exit. As I did so, a few brown hairs fell to the floor. I picked them up and put them in my pocket. As I slowly opened the door, it creaked slightly. Suddenly, the noise above me stopped. My heart jumped into my throat. I stopped breathing. My mind sent me unhelpful images of the creature leaping down and dismembering me as I stood still as a statue. I smelled smoke. I looked up and saw black plumes coming from the turbine. I ran back to my Jeep as fast as I could. I refused to look when I heard a roar behind me. I almost ran into my boss's car as he rounded the corner. "What the hell?" he said as he got out. "Look, look," I said, pointing at the turbine. "I see," he said. "What the hell have you done?" "No, look," I said, pointing at the black smoke. What am I supposed to see but millions of dollars literally going up in smoke? I stopped and looked at the burning machine, but there was no creature. I jumped into the car and slammed the door. "Can we please go?" I said, trying to hide my fear. He stared at me, then got into the car and drove back to the main building. All the while, I kept casting furtive glances behind us. He parked in front of the building and looked over at me. "You're going to have to answer some questions." "I know. Would someone please get my car? I ran out of petrol, that's why I was in the turbine." "Why didn't you just wait in your car?" I opened my mouth to answer, then realized what I was about to say and stopped, leaving it unsaid. "Okay," he said, getting out. "I'll send someone for your car." I followed him inside and lay down on the couch in the break room. A short time later, a colleague woke me. "Here are the keys to your car. It's parked outside," he said, "and the boss wants to see you." I took the keys and stood up. I looked right at the boss's office, then left at the exit. It took only a moment of decision to turn left and walk out the door. I never came back, but the memory of that night has never left me and never will. The next day, I read in the paper about the turbine fire and how they had found the carcass of a bear that must have been trapped in the flames. But I knew better. I knew the company would come after me for destroying their expensive turbine. I also knew that if I told the truth, they'd take me away in a rubber dinghy. Either way, I would disappear, and my story would never be told. I found a group that specialized in unexplained phenomena. I walked into their office with a bag in my pocket containing 3 brown hairs. I knew they'd want to hear my story,